it's hold on here. Hey there, I'm Renee Hobbs. Welcome to the Media Education Lab. We are now live streaming on YouTube, and we welcome Brian Gregory to our program here. I know it's working when I hear my voice coming back to me. Thank you so much for joining us. I don't know about you, but I find that as I have gotten older, I become much more interested in history. I didn't think I cared about history when I was 17, 18, or 19, but man, every year I get older, I get more and more interested in history. And I start to discover how important it is to understand history, to understand the complexity of the reality we inhabit today. And so that's why I am so very grateful and appreciative to recognize Brian C. Gregory, who has done some really interesting work in the history of early media literacy. This is a specialty topic that helps us understand the roots of this complex, multidisciplinary field. Brian, we're so grateful to you for sharing your expertise with us. And I'm just going to turn it over to you, buddy. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Renee. And thanks everybody for joining today. So as Renee said, my name is Brian Gregory. I'm an assistant professor at in St. Francis College. And what you're seeing here, this is a picture of students listening to radio. You can kind of see a radio there in the bottom right-hand corner. And as we'll talk about today, listening was happening all throughout the early 1900s, and it started with radio. So yeah, a bit about me. I'm an assistant professor of communication and media at St. Francis College. And I moved to New York City in the early 2000s. I worked at about 20 years ago or more at an audio mastering house. You can see a picture there, a lot of fancy audio equipment. And I worked there for a number of years. And then I became a freelance audio engineer in the film and music industries. And I became really interested in how sound is used to teach critical listening and education. I was working on film sets, and I oftentimes found that people working on films, they were really interested in sound, but a lot of them didn't know how sound worked. And so I became really interested in this. And then I went on for my master's in my EDD at Teachers College at Columbia University. But I got a lot of my foundational knowledge working in audio mastering. Audio mastering is the last process before a recording goes off to the manufacturer to get pressed. And so I really honed my ears in some very intricate listening in the recording environment. So today I'm going to talk about the research that came out of that. In my master's and doctoral program, I took a course on the history of sound studies at Princeton University, and I got really interested in, as Renee kind of talks about, the importance of history in the roots of media literacy. And so I'm going to focus today on how critical listening emerged with educational radio at the local level, and it emerged with really well-funded college stations. Like one of them was Ohio State University, which I'll talk about today, and Wisconsin, the University of Wisconsin-Madison was another one. But there was some really fascinating work that was going on at these universities in the 30s and the 40s. And then, so I'm going to talk about the origins of this stuff in educational radio and kind of some of the competing the contrast between educational radio at the local level and commercial radio that was happening at the time, and then how it transitioned into other fields. Listening actually becomes very ingrained in the field of English and speech in the 1950s. And so I'll talk about that. So here you have a picture. This is Edgar Dale. He is the second from the right. To his left is I. Keith Tyler. We'll talk about I. Keith Tyler as well. The woman there is actually unidentified in this image, but she was surely involved in the work that was going on in radio and media studies at the time. And on the right is a gentleman named Norman Woelfel. So Edgar Dale, some of you may know Edgar Dale. He is oftentimes considered kind of the godfather of media literacy in the 30s. He's well known really for his work on audiovisual teaching and the instructional benefits of film and newspapers and radio. But a lot of people know him for the Pain Fund studies. So the Pain Fund studies were a set of studies in the 1930s that looked at the effects of film on young people. And a lot of this stuff was funded by the federal government and also local funding arms. So Edgar Dale, with his work on radio pedagogy, so this stuff is actually a lot lesser known than his work on film. He started this publication in 1935 called The Newsletter, and the newsletter was published by the Ohio State University Educational Research Institute. Dale wrote of radio, he said the effects of such auditory bombardment of radio listening have not been investigated. So he had this pedagogical triangle, it's called the cone of experience, that he used to look at direct experiences and mediated experiences through technology. So in an article published by the Newsletter, which I saw in a compendium of his works, he published an article called Learning by Listening. And in Learning by Listening, which was also published in the Newsletter, Dale said that listening was, quote, a unitary part of the language process. So Dale and a lot of people studying communication modes at this time were starting to look at them through, 4 modes: reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And Dale said that all of this must be a part of the teacher's plan for what he called good communication. And you'll find these discussions in the historical archival research coming up again and again through the next 15, 20, 30 years. So in the same article, Dale argued that radio should be used to promote what he called good listening programs to excellent programs, as he called it. And he said that listeners should learn to practice critical and discriminating listening. He said that if they did that combined with fruitful conversations in the classroom, this would really help to spur like fruitful discussions and iterative learning in the classroom. So next you have a picture. This is a picture called Will King Textbook Be Dethroned? And I found this picture a number of years ago doing research at the Ohio State University archives. So what you can see here, this is really fascinating. You can see King textbook situated on a perch, says the seat of learning, and you have other communication modes, the radio. I think they're cut off at, I think that may be learning while at work, general reading, movies, talkies, and trips and tours. And what's happening is that all of these other modes are trying to pull King textbook off of its throne. They're saying, we want you as a brother, not as a king, because what was happening in the 30s was there, along with kind of the origins of media literacy, people were saying, well, look at all these other modes. These other modes have pedagogical benefits too. And so Will King textbook Be Dethroned is kind of getting at that discussion. And so along with this picture, I found this really interesting article that kind of illustrates Dale's beliefs. So Dale was really part of the progressive movement in the 30s, and a lot of Dale's writings, and one that was published in this compendium of his works, along with the Learning by Listening article, Dale references Dewey, and there's a whole paper on John Dewey and how progressive education can be used to further classroom engagement. And so I found this article, and this article talks about the potential of radio as a sound medium for providing students with concrete participatory learning experiences. And Dale connects it with this cone of experience, which was kind of part of his pedagogical wheelhouse. So there's a fascinating quote in this article too. It says, radio becomes a new sort of textbook, oral instead of visual. Oral learning aids have advantages over visual ones because, quote, they're dramatic. Outstanding personalities carry their own force in their voices, and those voices transmitted by radio bring a new interest to the pupils. So earlier in my research, I actually look at the idea of personality culture, and the way that personality culture was very prevalent in commercial radio. So there's this contrasting and competing discourse that's happening between local educational radio at schools like Ohio State and commercial-based educational radio. NBC had this very popular radio program called the Music Appreciation Hour, with this conductor named Walter Damrosch, who was very, very enmeshed in the music field in New York, and came from this very musical family. So next we have we're going to go back to the picture with Dale, I. Keith Tyler, and others. So on the left is I. Keith Tyler, and I. Keith Tyler was the director of the Educational Research Bureau at OSU. And he worked there from the 1930s to the 1940s. The Educational Research Bureau put out some really fascinating bulletins and studies on the effects of radio and media. There was this one study also on the Walter Damrosch Music Appreciation Hour and the ways that it promoted personality culture, but not really critical listening. So there's this tension going on there. And so in 1939, Tyler published an article called Developing Critical Listening. And in this article, there were so many fascinating quotes. One is that he said, radio has created an educational need of tremendous significance, which grows out of the nature of our democratic society. And so people like Tyler and Dale were very concerned about the ways that radio and other audio media. I'm also interested in things like the phonograph, and even going all the way back to the player piano, how these things were envisioned and used in education. And so Tyler, he was Dale was kind of the pedagogue and the theorist, and Tyler was really the practitioner. And Tyler worked with Dale. He was really exposed to a lot of Dale's progressive pedagogy. And he said he believed that citizens needed the capacity to practice self-governance, he said, by practicing critical and discriminating listening with regard to sources of information and opinion. And so we'll see this also come up a bit later in some of the other discussions. So Tyler said that doing so would provide students with the capacities and skills to not be, quote, swept off our feet by the honeyed promises of would-be dictators, not stirred to the hatred by the fiery phrases of the impassioned rabble-rouser. So Tyler, like Edgar Dale and others, he saw the necessity for improved listening as important to combat things like radio propaganda, radio programming's capability to incite action. Of course, you have during this time Orson Welles' War of the Worlds. And so people were very, very concerned about the psychological effects on radio. There's a really fascinating book called The Psychology of Radio that was written by Hadley Cantrell and Gordon Allport, came out in 1935. And so Tyler, for Tyler, the responsibility for critical listening and the development of it in young people, he argued that it rested on people like teachers and parents. Teachers and parents, of course, have so much influence on young people. And so they believed that teachers and parents had to help young people to develop discriminating and critical listening in order to counter harmful radio messages and their effects on democratic engagement. So next we're going to look at a bulletin that was published by the Ohio State University Bureau of Educational Research. So this guy named Irving Robbins, he was a colleague of Tyler at the Educational Research Bureau. And in 1942, he published this bulletin called Teaching Radio Programming Discrimination. And this was based on his observations with teachers and students who were in all levels, all the way from preschool, primary school, junior high, all the way up through high school, right outside of Columbus, Ohio, where OSU, of course, is located. So Robbins had 5 goals for this study. The first one was for students to develop standards for judging radio programs. The second was for them to develop skills to confirm that they had, in fact, learned information. The third was for them to develop critical attitudes towards advertising. And fourth was for them to develop collaborative skills and co-creating listening recommendations. So what was really interesting is that teachers worked with their students to develop these recommendations on how to listen to radio programming right there in the classroom. And then fifth was for them to have enthusiasm for good educational radio programs. And you can contrast this with what was happening on the commercial stations, many of which were seen as detrimental to young people. So they were directly combating some of the commercial criticisms that people had. So with Irving Robbins' study, he had classroom teachers work with students to collaboratively write questions. He had them our teachers worked with students to select suitable programs and also examine the truth and veracity, clarity, and intended audiences for types of advertising. One set of students, this is really interesting, they looked at the Lone Ranger program, and they listened to the Lone Ranger program, they did some analysis on it, and a lot of the students actually questioned whether the character, the Lone Ranger, was real in American history. So what they did was they went home, they talked to their parents, they talked to their teachers, they looked at things like encyclopedias, and then at the end of the research, all but one student confirmed that the Lone Ranger was fictional, and that they couldn't find the Lone Ranger anywhere in the literature. So they said it must be fictional, but one student, I don't know why, didn't actually find that. So yeah. So with teaching radio program and discrimination, and this is the cover for the bulletin. In the study, they analyzed radio dramatization ads, and students, after analyzing ads, demonstrated that they didn't believe all that they heard, that actually analyzing the ads had helped them to learn something. And Robbins concluded that students were capable of discussing elements of radio shows related to sound, like critical analysis of voices, music, sound effects, as well as things like story, plot, and the sales drive of advertising. Robbins said that students had learned to listen and become aware of the need to critically analyze claims that they heard over the radio, that he actually felt that there was some real learning going on based on what they listened to. And so next we're going to talk about Dorothy Gordon. So this is Dorothy Gordon. Dorothy Gordon was the host for a panel-style radio program called Youth Forum in the early to mid 1940s. And Youth Forum was a program that was led by students from the New York City metropolitan schools. And the program was modeled after principles of like democratic engagement and deliberation. There was a radio format during this time called the Public Forum radio format. And the Youth Forum program was broadcast over WQXR AM, which is actually still in existence today. The New York Times purchased WQXR, and what was really interesting about the beginnings of this is that they were very, very skeptical. The New York Times editorial board was very skeptical of the Youth Forum, and they brought Dorothy Gordon in along with the owners of the Times, and they listened to the program, and they actually said, wow, if people had these kinds of discussions that the students were having, they wouldn't be as good as if they were adults. And so the style of the Youth Forum program, so she recruited students from New York City metro schools. There were 6 students on each panel from private, parochial, and public schools. And Gordon encouraged students to talk. She said only if they wanted to, no pressure on the students. And she reassured them to not be hard on themselves if they couldn't remember what they said. Something also that was very interesting is that when students would come in with notes, she'd say, sit on your notes. And then they couldn't use their notes during the live broadcast. And she said she found them to be very, very articulate in doing so. So I looked at Dorothy Gordon's oral history collection at the Columbia University Libraries. And so Gordon, she embodied this progressive ethos of transactional interpersonal communication and cooperation. She also was a very well-read person, she read something like 8 newspapers per day, and she said that she had a photographic memory to remember what was said. And when students would bring up points on the program or in the preparation for the program, because she'd read so much, she could know where their opinions and where their what they were saying was coming from. So on the program, she encouraged democratic participation, equal opportunity, student representation, and the foregrounding of student interests. At the beginning of the show, it was just Gordon and the 6 students. And then later on in the show's tenure, she included adult experts on the show. And this was to provide factual information. But she actually said to the adults that came on not to jeopardize the show and, to really leave it to the students to have the discussion. So Gordon said that opinion was based on knowledge, but adult experts were there to provide factual clarification for student-based opinions. And so through this, she promoted listening. She promoted listening to the students, and she also promoted listening between the students. Gordon believed that it was her role to draw students out through using facts and evidence with assistance from the adult experts. And students would often admit, interestingly, to changing their minds after being on this show and having these very important discussions, social and political discussions with one another. So Gordon, what's interesting about Gordon is if we bring it back to kind of the tensions that were happening between commercial radio and local educational radio, Gordon, her progressive ideals actually clashed with free market enterprise, beliefs about free market enterprise and cooperation. She believed that cooperation was preferable to radio regulation and advertising. And at this time, there were a lot of people who were fighting for greater radio regulation. Even though the 1934 Communications Act had already been passed, there was still this tension that was going on well into the 1940s. And Gordon, what was interesting is that she did not recognize that this ideological stance she didn't recognize that these things impact the content of what's created, how children receive it, and their learning. But she was very much about commercial cooperation, and that's what a lot of the historical documentation shows. So this is the transition between listening and radio, and then how it transitioned to the English field. So concerns about listening as a new form of media literacy, they went past radio into the 1940s. You had educators and researchers who were trying to do large-scale studies on the role of listening in education with radio, but then in English, and even then in the field of speech, and it goes beyond that too. And so they became interested in listening in English. And I just, back in January, I went to the National Council of Teachers of English Archives at the University of Illinois. And I looked at, there are some fascinating documents, one of which was they had this commission on the English language curriculum. And the English language curriculum studied how to organize the field in the early 50s, late 40s, and then on into the 60s. And with this, they put out 3 curriculum guides. The first one, I think, was in 1952. And it was called the English Language Arts. And so they created in this curriculum guide and all the discussions leading up to this publication, they created these 4 committees to study 4 communication modes: reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And all the way from preschool, all the way up through high school, and then into college. And I. Keith Tyler, interestingly, was very much involved in this. So he was involved at the OSU Educational Research Bureau, but he was also very much involved in the NCTE and the kind of creation of listening as a subfield of English. And so the NCTE and state education boards in the US, they published lots of articles, curriculum guides for teachers with recommendations on lessons and activities for how to teach each mode of communication. And states also put these things out. States like New Mexico, that's the first one that comes to mind, but there's a handful of states that actually put out these curriculum guides that came out of all the NCTE research. And so the first guide, published in 52, was called the English Language Arts. And using previous research, there was this this gentleman, I think he was at University of Minnesota. His name was Ralph Nichols, and Ralph Nichols was very much involved in the creation of listening as a field. He actually was one of the founders for the professional, or for the academic organization, what we know today as International Communication Association. He actually helped found the ICA in 1950 and wrote an article on listening in the very first journal publication. So using previous research, the first guide argues for 4 types of listening: critical listening, also purposeful listening, accurate listening, and appreciative listening. And these classifications show up time and time again in the research. And some suggestions they had for critical listening included how to analyze voices, how to listen to plays, which you see here, listening to a recorded play. This picture is from the NCTE. Also hearing speaker bias, hearing emotion-related terms, things like fallacies, unsupported generalizations, and inferences. And on the left here, you can see these are students who are reading along with the teacher, listening to a radio, and so there's an example of kind of the listening that was happening during that time. So in the 1960s, the English language curriculum, what was very interesting, it shifted from 4 modes, reading, writing, speaking, and listening, to they took out listening, and it was literature, composition, and language. But interestingly, what's going to happen is language is going to be taken out too. Language goes over to speech mostly, and then listening has this really weird place. It kind of gets into speech a little bit, but it becomes part of the discussion movement. There's a really fascinating book called Democracy of Discussion, written by William Keith, which looks at the history of the discussion movement and its origins in debate. So listening in the 60s kind of leaves English, but it doesn't really. There's still people writing about it even into the 70s. But as an official stance, the NCTE no longer recognizes listening as part of English education. And so listening moves into speech, and my research kind of indicates, I'm still working this out, but it indicates that it continues to be underrepresented into the late 60s and the early 70s. I recently got back a couple days ago from the NEA archives at George Washington University, and I looked at something called the National Training Laboratory, which was an organization in the 40s and 50s, which looked at how to get people together to have and study discussion on a very evidence-based level. And so that's kind of where my research is leading right now. But yeah, that's kind of the history of listening, with mostly on educational radio in English.
Okay, so Brian, can you read aloud the 3 questions that you're going to invite the group to engage in discussion about when we move into small group discussions?
Sure. So yeah, here's 3 questions that I have kind of related to listening. The first is listening underrepresented in 21st century education and pedagogy? Second, how can understanding the history of listening in the context of educational media literacy help teachers, researchers, and policymakers promote civic education and deliberative dialogue in an era in which we have increased partisan antipathy, political polarization, and distrust in media and big tech? And thirdly, what are some ways that you teach and or encourage listening in your own contexts?
Awesome. Okay, so I modified those just slightly, and you'll see in the chat a version of those. I'm going to take a screenshot, Brian, of your original questions here so I can take it with me into the breakout groups. We're going to invite you to be in a group of about 5 people, 5 or 6 people. And we want you to introduce yourselves to each other. If people are new in this room, sometimes people are even coming for the very first time to the Media Education Lab. So go around the room and introduce yourself to each other briefly, but then choose one of those three questions to talk about. Give me a thumbs up if you understand what's going to happen. We're going to take about 15 minutes for this. You're going to make a new friend. You're going to get a chance to share ideas and respond to Brian's fascinating presentation, and then we'll come back together for some large group discussion. All right, rooms are open. Have a great conversation. Okay, we're back. Thank you so much for joining in this small group conversation. I don't know about you, but our group had a really rich and lively discussion. Now's our chance to hear a little bit about some ideas that came up in that small group discussion that were particularly meaningful to you. And then Brian, you'll get the last word. You'll get the last 3 or 4 minutes to remind us of key ideas that you want us to take away. But let's go around the room and share. What was an idea that was meaningful to you? Paul, I'm going to call on you, buddy.
Sure. Well, we had a great conversation. Brian, Joyce, and Ying Li. Talked. It kind of went into podcasting, and we talked a lot about how essentially we try to use different types of podcasting activities and exercises with our students, and how critical listening is so important for those kinds of assignments. And then we also talked a little bit about how I guess, kind of social media addled culture that we live in now is all about getting your thing out there first, right? Getting your snarky comment or getting your opinion or whatever, and what impact that may have on our ability or our willingness to listen to each other. So it was an excellent conversation.
Open your microphone. Thank you for sharing, Paul. Open your microphone. What ideas of Paul's do you want to build on, amplify, extend, or what other ideas came up in your small group discussion?
In our group, Anshal, who is from India, pointed out how complicated it is to use all your senses at once to dive into different aspects of media. So she's trying basically say she's been here for 8 years. Her English is excellent, even though she may not think so. She speaks beautifully. She taught herself, but she spoke about the need to focus on one sense. So she's been doing a lot of listening to the radio and picking up on that. And she spoke about how people, if they speak too emotionally, she questions if it's news, people should speak in a much more, I don't want to use the word flat, but in a more matter-of-fact tone. So that was one thing.
Thank you
the other
for sharing.
Yeah, I'll let someone else go because we had other things as well.
We'll see if we can flush out.
I can't believe the time is
that came up.
Disappearing.
Oh, and Jen, what was something that came out of our discussion that you want to share?
I mean, to echo what Paul was saying, we also talked about how kids are like quick to jump in, but we also talked about how at the same time we don't always listen to children and sharing their voices. And then obviously, like, I have a music background, so we were just talking about we talked about the concept of appreciation of listening, and this doesn't have to be specific to music, but I, in my classroom, don't necessarily define appreciation as liking something, but more understanding of something and having a respect for something so that at least you can appreciate why others might like it, or let's say have that opinion if we wanted to think more critically about why we're here.
I found that to be a big idea, and I was really grateful for that untangling appreciation and liking. Michelle, Joyce, Randall, what was a big idea that came up in the small group discussion that you'd like to amplify or share?
Renee, one of the things that we were talking about, and Paul and I both do this, was assigning students audio products. And trying to figure out how to assess them. And Paul noted that students who listen back to their audio that's shared publicly will be critical of their work and want to go back and improve it. And I've had the same experience.
That's fascinating. So then the revision process comes very naturally as students want to improve their audio creative work. Oh, I really wish I knew more about using audio and audio activities in the classroom. I do a little bit of that myself, but we might need to have a webinar on that. Audio production activities in the classroom. Love
We
it.
we also discussed the importance of not dismissing audiobooks as not reading.
And why is that important? Why are you passionate about that?
I am, personally, because I love it, but also because for me, audio is such an enriching experience. They're interpreted. I get that they're different necessarily from the text, but there are so many audiobooks that are done in the language of a culture or in a dialogue that I would not have perceived before. And the acting is superior in most of these things. And it is such an enjoyable experience. And I have friends who are in my book clubs who don't enjoy a book as much as I do. And I have a feeling it's because they haven't experienced it in the same way.
Thanks for sharing. Who's next? Michelle, Anshal. Katie, we know she can't talk. We know Katie's in a classroom right now. What was an idea that came up that was meaningful to you?
I can go next. I think overall, all the ideas were good. I think only when they all are applied together, that is when you will see a result. Just a standalone idea is not going to get us the result we want. And for me, the main was the focus, starting at the root, which would be focus, and then mixing all of this, and how you said the very high quality experience, because I am looking for engagement and engage from there, like the focus and coming to engagement and everything quality in between, in whichever medium, whichever form, doesn't matter. So, yeah.
Engagement being a huge motive for using texts like audio materials. Michelle, Ying Li, Randall, Angela, what was an idea that came up in the small group discussion that was meaningful for you? I'll tell you one thing that Michelle.
No, I just, because my face is here, I feel like I need to answer. I was a little late to this discussion. I mean, not the discussion part, but I was on the road while this was starting. And I guess I kind of missed the leading concept. So I appreciated, just listening. I really didn't, I don't think I quite have a handle on what the task was today, but
Oh yeah, no worries, no worries. And
the thing that I am taking away from all of these interactions with this program is just how difficult it can be to discern truth in what you're hearing. And I think that's probably our biggest problem. Barbara was talking about it a bit, of just, the need for facts, and there doesn't seem to be a good reliable place to get facts that are just facts and not, I mean, if you want facts, I guess you can find them, but it's a lot of work. And I wish there was some way for people to obtain truthful information more directly, and with less trauma, as Anshal was saying.
It's interesting that it's just as difficult, or maybe more difficult now than it was in the 1930s, to figure out all the different voices and points of view, all the different kinds of persuasion that was mixed in with information back then and today. In a way, it hasn't changed much. Brian, you get the last word. What do you want to, how do you respond to the way folks reacted to your talk, and what key ideas do you want to leave us with in the next few minutes? Turn on your microphone.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for joining today. This was great. I just enjoyed learning from everybody and having the small group discussion, and then hearing these takeaways. I mean, it's really, I think it's just really fascinating to think about the ways that this history connects to the present, and the ways that we use listening and, in order to kind of promote classroom engagement. I mean, what was so interesting about all this research is that really one of the biggest arguments is that the teacher is paramount. Like, the teacher is what's important. Having teachers who promote engagement and who promote media literacy and whatever its form is so key. And so yeah, you know, I love doing historical research and I love learning about this stuff, and just thinking about like how it can be used to you know, to promote better listening today, because you know, I think we really live in a time in which listening is difficult because of the technologies, things like Chat GPT, which we talked about in our breakout room, and the influx of all of these sound technologies that we're all exposed to and our students are exposed to on a daily basis. So yeah, I really enjoyed this, and thank you so much.
We'll give you a round of applause. Thank you so much, Brian, for being part of this program today. I feel like history allows us to recover ideas that might have gotten lost along the way, right? And that why we do history is to kind of understand what has been lost and try to find it, to recover it again. And that's partly why I wanted just to invite you to go check out, where is it here? I think I can check out the Grandparent Gallery at the grandparentsofmedialiteracy.com. Media literacy has many grandparents, right? And depending on who you are, you might want to learn more about Edgar Dale. There he is, right? Or Noam Chomsky, or John Dewey, or John Fisk, or Michel Foucault, because understanding our ancestors really helps us think about what values we bring into the present day, right? So what I really love about the Grandparents website is that you can learn a little bit about Edgar Dale, and then anyone who logs in can say how they influence. So Frank Baker has contributed how he read something about Edgar Dale in 1946, and that really influenced his decisions about making purchasing decisions when he was a director of the school library system in Orlando, Florida. Like, isn't that amazing, right? And so learn more about the ancestors of media literacy. And of course, I do hope that you come to our events coming up. Check it out. We've got tomorrow, Preventing Violent Extremism, March 30th, Copyright Clarity for Digital Learning. Our media club returns on April 3rd, where we're talking about the AI revolution, and then our AI in the Classroom series begins. So thanks for being part of it. I'm Renee Hobbs at the Media Education Lab. You guys had a great lunch hour. I was so glad you were here. Brian, thank you so much for being part of our learning community. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Happy
Bye-bye. Thank you again.
spring.
Happy
Happy
spring.
spring to everybody. See you tomorrow, Renee.
All right. See you later. Bye.